I am joined by someone that Tom Luongo and Alex Craner have talked to me a lot about. So I've gone straight to the source to find out what it is, what his arguments are, and who's really running the show.
Take the first step towards online privacy. Get NordVPN.
When tyranny becomes law, rebellion becomes a duty. So said Thomas Jefferson. Go to bit.ly/lawful tax protest or bit.ly/make war history and find out why it is a criminal offence to pay central government or local government taxes in the UK. And let's make war history. Hi, this is Crypto Rich, and I am joined by Richard Poe. Richard Poe is the author of How the British Invented Communism and Blamed It on the Jews. And his basic premise is that underneath all the chicanery that is going on in the West, currently and for many years, it's the British. So we'll get into that. Now, before I introduce him, please subscribe, follow me on Twitter, CryptoRichYT, join my official Telegram announcements channel. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please come and support my work on Odyssey, Rumble, and X, because I'm censored on YouTube. Hey, Richard, thank you so much for making yourself available. And
go
on.
Oh, I just thank you. Thank you. Great to be here.
You're so welcome. And I've been away for 3 weeks in my home country, and I read your book, How the British Invented Communism and Blamed It on the Jews. And one is I found it very thrilling and compelling, it was digestible and enjoyable to read. So thank you so much for that. But the other thing about it, and I'm not disputing your arguments because it is referenced and you have all the citations, but it was a hard pill to swallow. Come on, that's not what we were taught in the history books. The British are the good guys.
Well, I'm not exactly trying to say they're bad guys, no worse than anyone else. Actually, my take on the British is that they're pretty much doing what any nation does, looking after its own interests, or at least the interests of its ruling class, which is an important distinction to make. The interests of the British ruling class are not the same as the British people in general, and that's true of really every country that I know of. The worst thing that I accuse the British of really is not being the bad guys, but simply of being much better than everybody else at doing what they do, at pursuing their own interests. And what I uncovered through my research is that the British elites began talking about and recognizing as early as the late 19th century that the world was changing, and especially that the United States of America was emerging as potentially a new leader of the world. And they understood that they were not going to be able to compete with the US, so they formed a plan to merge with the US. And still, the object of this plan was to avail themselves of US military power and resources and financial power, while still retaining control of imperial policy. And the specific way they proposed of doing this, which was proposed by Cecil Rhodes, among others, as early as 1877, their specific plan was to lure and persuade the United States to join a global union of English-speaking countries, to merge with all English-speaking countries in the world into a giant English-speaking superstate that would rule the world. Now, interestingly, just yesterday, Elon Musk retweeted a post by some British guy saying exactly that. He said, "Hey, I've got a great idea. Let's get all the English-speaking countries in the world to merge together into a single country." And Elon retweeted that and said, "Good idea." So that was a great promotion for my book in a way, because a lot of people say, "Well, Richard, this idea of getting all the Anglo-Saxon countries together, that happened over 100 years ago, when Anglo-Saxons still existed, and now that's all ancient history. Nobody's looking after the interests of the Anglo-Saxon race or the English-speaking peoples as such." And now we find in a flash, Elon has told us this plan is very much alive and very much on the table, and he apparently endorses it for whatever reasons. I don't know if Trump endorses it. He's been putting forth other ideas. such as annexing Canada and Greenland into the United States. But this idea has now, and it was, I call it the British Roundtable scheme, because it was pushed by what was originally a sort of secret society of British elites called the Round Table, and it was very much their scheme, their brand. It was the thing they were noted for, was their obsession with creating this English-speaking union, this English-speaking superstate. So it's really, in a sense, reassuring to me as an author that the thing that I stated has effectively been proven in the last 24 hours, that this plan is not just something from Victorian or Edwardian history from long ago. It's very much on the table now by the biggest movers and shakers that we know. And so the question is, why is it on the table? What is the purpose of it? And how does it affect us? And should we be for or against it? I think it comes down to that.
Okay. Well, I mean, I can see it because I don't know if you know, but I interview Tom Longer and Alex Craner once a month, and Tom's been coming on my channel for years, and they keep talking about your ideas and pointing out, oh, Nord Stream, well, the British were involved there. And then I know what happened in my home country. It's not safe for me to mention that by name, but when the current Prime Minister, sorry, who's now in prison for over 500 days, that just before him and his party were ousted in a parliamentary vote, there was a new ambassador appointed by Britain who was ex-MI6. So there is, and then it was Johnson who flew out to Ukraine to scuttle the agreement that Turkey had negotiated between Russia and Ukraine to end the war 2 months after it started. So there's all this evidence of British shenanigans, but it looks like, or it's presented, or the mainstream media, or people on the left, which is politically where I'm from. Well, the UK is US's poodle. The idea that the UK, that there are these, I don't know, secret ruling class elites behind the shadows who are running everything, well, it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, in the conventional view.
Well, you're absolutely right, and this is the biggest objection that people raise to my writings and to my recent book. They say, well, England just doesn't have that kind of power anymore. It's obvious, they say, that British power has declined, and that the British influence, the British Empire, has been completely replaced by American power. But when you look at the history, when you go back 100, 120 years, when all these plans were formed in the first place, the fact is Great Britain was in the same position back then as it is now. It was a small country, rather poor in resources, without a large population, certainly not able to field large land armies to go up against larger countries like Russia and Germany, France, the US. Every
Or
great
even
power.
India.
Yeah, that's right. Well, India is a perfect example, because at certain points I have read the Indian personnel in the British army in India outnumbered actual British personnel by as much as 4 to 1 or more. And so you have to say, well, if India didn't want to be a British colony, and if the British had trained and armed so many of them, why didn't and if they outnumbered the British army of occupation, let's call it, why didn't they rebel and kick the British out? They had overwhelming physical power to do so, and they had it for a very long time. Well, this is where we get to the secret of British power, which some might call soft power, the ability to, some might actually call it brainwashing or mind control, but the ability to persuade people through psychological means that it's in their own interest to cooperate with British agendas, even though, as in the case of India, they had certainly had the physical power to run the British out of the country for a very long time before ultimately winning independence. And the British knew that, and they didn't care, because they're used to doing things that way. This is quintessentially how they work. Britain has always been a small country, as I said, and has never had a large enough population to compete with other countries in terms of their armed forces in terms of their boots on the ground. But because of that, they developed different ways of surviving and thriving in the world, which is basically to play off larger countries against each other, to get them fighting with each other in order to preserve what the British call a balance of power, and also to very cunningly choose their allies and to cultivate allies such as now the United States of America in the present day, who will willingly expend their own resources and their own blood and treasure to pursue British interests without even actually realizing that the interests they're pursuing are British. And here again, I would point to Elon Musk's post of yesterday, where he basically put this idea before the whole X community, and I think it has several million views at this point. And all the comments, almost all the comments are, whether they're for or against it, just none of them seem to realize that this was a British idea that was first put forth in 1877. Some people say, oh, well, this is the Kanzuk idea, which it is in part, but just virtually nobody is recognizing the pure British origin of this idea, that it was specifically a plan by the highest levels of British elites, formulated at least as early as the 1870s, and whose actual purpose was to preserve British hegemony, to preserve Great Britain as the leading hegemon of the world, specifically by incorporating the United States of America into an English-speaking superstate that the British then felt confident they could be the ones controlling it. Now, the only question really is, did this plan succeed? The British felt they could control this English-speaking superstate just as they controlled India, even though they were vastly outnumbered and physically incapable of dealing with a military confrontation, a full-scale military confrontation, if that happened. They couldn't even do that in India. It had the British, had the Indian portion of the British Army actually mutinied and tried to kick them out, they would have been kicked out. But so the question, so similarly with this new English-speaking union, which has been slowly coalescing and coming together throughout the 20th and 21st centuries in the form of increasingly closer bonds between English-speaking countries, beginning with, well, the first attempt was the League of Nations, which the United States Senate rejected back in 1919 and 1920, but then finally the Atlantic Alliance, NATO, the United Nations, all of which were of British origin and were British ideas to further this plan. And the idea of global government with a core of English-speaking countries ruling it was also pushed by Winston Churchill during the 1940s when the U.S. was fighting shoulder to shoulder with the British in World War II. And Churchill and his advisors were pushing full speed ahead to use this crisis of World War II to finally bring the Americans into a permanent military alliance, which became NATO, and into a permanent intelligence alliance, which became the Five Eyes Alliance, as well as into a political alliance through the UN system, which has been growing stronger and stronger. And so this plan of ever closer union between the UK and its possessions and the United States of America, this plan, first put forth in 1877, has been pursued relentlessly and, in my opinion, successfully through 2 world wars and the Cold War. And it looks like we're approaching a point where the final stage of the plan is now being proposed, which is a formal political alliance between all the English, not an alliance, but a union, a merger between all the English-speaking countries. So it looks to me as if this British plan has gone full speed ahead without interruption and is now nearing a successful conclusion. So if someone wants to say to me, well, the British aren't the ones pushing it anymore, I think the burden is on them to prove it, because it was their plan to begin with. The United States people certainly were dead set against it, totally rejected the League of Nations when it was first put forth, and only accepted the UN after another world war, which I would contend was also instigated by the British, as was World War One. That may be a controversial opinion in some quarters, but I just see no sign that this British Roundtable scheme was ever in the slightest bit, that it never stumbled. It just went straight ahead, and exactly what the British said they were going to do, they did it. So, given that fact, it just if the British came up with this plan, if they pursued this plan relentlessly with great persistence and enterprise over a period of more than 100 years, and if the plan is now nearing its final phase of completion, again, I would challenge anybody to explain to me why we should not at least consider the possibility that the British are still the ones who are primarily leading and pushing this plan, which historically was theirs from the very beginning and was always theirs. It looks to me like let's say they're the key suspects.
Right, right. Well, the thing is, you and I, we're not privy to what actually goes on. So we make an assessment with the information that we have. And your book has been meticulously researched, because you're not just throwing out these ideas just because you fancy them. No, you cite references that support that argument. But who are these British elites? Like, who are they nowadays? Is it the City of London? Is it, I don't know, the Rothschilds, or others, or both, the royal family?
Well, I would certainly say all the above, and I'm sure quite a few others whose names we don't know. My assumption is that the most powerful families, and of course we'd be talking about elite families with great hereditary wealth. My theory, let's say, is that those families which are most important in the scheme of things are those we would know the least about, because they would have the power to keep their names quiet, and they would have the intelligence and the good sense to do so. One of the odd things about the Rothschild family is that ever since they emerged as being supposedly the most powerful people in the British Empire and maybe the world, and this was in the early 19th century when they emerged in that role, their names have been bandied about very freely and deliberately placed in everybody's face as supposedly being the most important and powerful people in the world. And that fact alone makes me doubt that they actually are that. Because I just don't. Certainly, if my family were secretly running the world, I'd want to keep that a secret. I wouldn't want to advertise, and I wouldn't want to put my face in everybody's face so everyone can hate me and envy me and try to topple me from my position. I would put somebody else's face out there. And so I assume that the leading globalist families, whoever they are, I assume they have the good sense to do that. And so my theory, my working theory is, because my study of history shows me that history tends toward, let's call it a conservatism, in the sense, I don't mean that ideologically, but in the sense that things generally don't change that much.
Mm.
We like to think that we live in a progressive society where everything is changing very quickly, but actually it's not true. The important things tend to stay the same. Technology changes, but the big things tend to stay the same much more than we realize. And much of the fabric of our civilization, of the way that we think and the way we act and the way we organize our society, can be traced back to the Neolithic age, back to the Stone Age. People, human nature, human religion, human beliefs, human style of organization just doesn't change that much. It tends to conserve itself. So because I have that belief and that bias, my assumption, and let's call it an assumption, is that whoever is running the world today probably hasn't changed very much in the last few centuries.
Yeah.
I would guess that whoever is running the world today, whoever those families are, probably for the most part are the same ones who were running it, let's say, 500 years ago.
Yeah.
I don't see any reason to assume they would have been toppled or replaced by anybody else. And so we're probably looking at a lot of families that would be regarded as aristocratic, as nobility. And there are indications that there are certain aristocratic families, and not just in England, but specifically there, who have a great deal more power than we're generally led to think. And so in my book, I quote one Justice Cohalan, an American justice of the New York Supreme Court. He testified in 1919 before the U.S. Senate during the hearings that were going on over whether or not the U.S. should sign the Versailles Treaty, which would have required us to join the League of Nations. Many people did not want to do that. In fact, it was extremely unpopular. Traditionally, Americans avoid any kind of binding alliance with foreign countries, but in particular, it was obvious to Americans that England was running the show. It was England who had drawn us into World War I, which most Americans did not want to do. And it was clearly the British who were putting forth this idea of global government under then the League of Nations. And this is a thing a lot of people don't know, by the way, which is that we have been fed a propaganda narrative that our president, Woodrow Wilson, was supposedly the father of globalism and the inventor and creator of this League of Nations idea. And that's totally not true and easily proven not to be true. That British elites were actively making plans for global government going back to the Napoleonic era. Before Napoleon was even defeated, the British were putting out plans for how to organize the world, the entire globe at that point, under some kind of rational system that would allow nations to meet together so they wouldn't have to resort to war anymore. This was always a British plan, and they often called it the Peace League, or they used various terms all through the 19th century. So by the time Woodrow Wilson proposed the so-called League of Nations in 1916, the British had already been pushing this idea for more than 100 years, and in the open. I mean, it was no secret. And in fact, we have letters that went back and forth between Woodrow Wilson's closest advisor, who turns out to have been a British agent, one Colonel Edward House. He was actually a British agent. He was actively working with the head of what we now call MI6 in America, a guy named Sir William Wiseman. They were very good friends, this Wiseman and Colonel House. And House was also corresponding directly with the British foreign minister, whose name escapes me for the moment at that time. But this minister, he sent a letter to Colonel House in 1916, basically saying, "Well, we'd like to get this League of Nations underway, but we think the idea would be better received coming from an American president instead of coming from us. Can you get Woodrow Wilson to announce this idea and to pretend that it's his idea?" And Colonel House said, "Of course, no problem. I'll do it." And that's exactly what happened. Wilson came forward. He gave a speech saying, "Let's create a League of Nations," and he literally pretended it was his idea, exactly as the British had requested. And ever since then, everyone thinks Woodrow Wilson was the father of globalism. He was nothing but a British pawn whose White House had been thoroughly penetrated by British intelligence with the help especially of this Colonel Edward House. And under this British influence, Wilson had done such things as starting the Federal Reserve in 1913, enacting the IRS Act, starting a federal income tax, which we'd never had before, and then finally getting us to join World War I, which was something the British had been planning for years because they wanted to take out both Germany and Russia. And this is the focus of my latest book, how the British invented communism and blamed it on the Jews. Because what I reveal in that book is that the British, by let's say 1900, by the late 1890s, early 1900s, they had reached a point where they felt their global power was sufficiently developed that they could take on all of their enemies, all of their competing rival powers in the world, and destroy them, or in the case of the United States, to incorporate it. And this is exactly what they did. They formulated a plan to start a world war, and their plan was specifically that the outcome of this war should be the defeat of Germany, that Germany should lose the war, but that Russia, who was England's ally, supposedly, should not win it. This is how they put it, that Germany should lose the war, but Russia should not win it. And this is exactly what happened. Germany lost the war. Germany was utterly defeated. But Russia, which should have been on the winning side since it was allied with England and France and the other allies, the British stabbed their Russian ally in the back. They plotted to overthrow the Tsar. They successfully overthrew him. And then they ultimately installed the Bolshevik government, which utterly destroyed any prospect of the return of the Romanov dynasty, which against whom the British felt a deep and long-lasting animus going back hundreds of years. They saw Russia and the Romanov dynasty in particular as their chief rivals for world dominion, quote unquote, as Queen Victoria famously put it. We call this concept globalism today, the idea of one central government ruling the whole world. But back in Victorian times, people were more plain spoken about these sorts of issues. And Queen Victoria, she didn't call it globalism, she called it world dominion. And she clearly said that Russia was the one force that was standing in Britain's way to achieve this world dominion. So what they did is they overthrew the Tsar and basically destroyed the Russian Empire through a civil war, which went on for about 5 years and killed about 10 million people. And what made it possible for Britain to do this was their alliance with the United States. It wasn't called an alliance then. The Americans were so averse to the word alliance that they called it an association instead. They didn't even want to use the A word of alliance. But it was not only an alliance, it was deeper than an alliance, because this William Wiseman, who was the head, he was the station chief for America for the British Foreign Intelligence Service. He had complete control. He had penetrated the Wilson White House and controlled Woodrow Wilson through his operative, his agent, Colonel Edward House. And so the British waited. They did not overthrow the Russian government until they knew with 100% certainty that the U.S. was going to enter the war immediately afterwards and not only replace Russia, but be a much better replacement than Russia, and send hundreds of thousands of troops to the Western Front to finish off Germany. And that's exactly what happened. It was an extraordinarily risky operation for the British. Could have gone sideways in a dozen different ways, but it didn't. It worked perfectly for them. And they won the war. They utterly destroyed all of their imperial rivals, all of the rival empires in the world, which had previously been competitors of Great Britain, were destroyed. All of the ruling monarchies of Europe, except that of Great Britain, of all, at least all the significant ones, the German monarchy, the Russian monarchy, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, they were all ended and destroyed. And this was the British plan. They destroyed all their rivals so that they became supreme, and they did it with the help of the United States, which they were essentially controlling at that point from the top through their penetration of the Wilson White House. So it's my contention, and I guess this goes back to your question of how can a little country like Britain, which is supposedly America's poodle, how could it control America? How could it control anyone? How could it do anything except take orders from the United States? And my answer is that they do it through the superiority of their intelligence services. And this is really critical. This is how they do it. The British, for centuries, for literally centuries, have specialized in exerting their influence invisibly through covert operations and through removing and overthrowing governments that stand in their way, and doing so covertly in such a way that it doesn't even appear that the British were involved. And we call these types of operations today color revolutions, when all of a sudden it appears the people of some country rise up and overthrow their government, and it all looks very organic and natural, and the people just didn't want their government anymore, so they overthrew it. But what I have found through my research is I have become very skeptical that this kind of organic revolution of the people, I don't know if that ever happened in history. I don't know if it can happen. I don't think the people rising up spontaneously with pitchforks in the streets, I don't think they have the capability to overthrow a strong sovereign government, which, among other things, is very much focused on keeping an eye on its people and keeping them under control and harshly punishing anybody who threatens its sovereignty. I don't think it's possible for an unorganized mass of people from the lower classes to simply rise up in anger and overthrow such a government. The very fact that that government exists means that it knows all the techniques and all of how to continue existing and surviving and keeping its people under control. And so the only way, in my opinion, this is my theory, the only way you can have a revolution and have it succeed is if you have some foreign power assisting the revolutionaries, and if you have people within the target government, very high level, powerful people within the target government cooperating with said foreign power. And this is what happened, as I explain in my book. This is what happened in the French Revolution. This is what happened in the Russian Revolution. This is what happened in virtually every revolution that in between in Europe, such as the 1848 revolutions, is that in one case after the other, once you investigate and look into it, you find the hidden hand of British intelligence infiltrating that country, recruiting disgruntled elements within that country's elites, and then organizing a supposedly spontaneous revolution of the people, but it's not spontaneous at all. It's a color revolution, planned and organized from London. This clearly happened in France in 1789, and for this we have no less an authority than Thomas Jefferson, who was then the first U.S. ambassador to France after independence. And Thomas Jefferson, along with his associate, the Marquis de Lafayette, were both supportive of the French Revolution in its beginning, and because they thought it was going to be a transformation of France into a sort of mild, liberal, constitutional monarchy. That's what they both wanted. But instead, according to Jefferson, and he wrote this in letters to Lafayette and to others, instead, Jefferson charges the British government infiltrated the French revolutionary forces and turned the revolution in a radical, violent direction, which had two effects. One, it resulted in violent elements taking over the government and executing the king and queen, which Jefferson and Lafayette never wanted to happen. And two, it resulted in the rise of communism for the first time, because communism, modern communism as we know it today, was born in the French Revolution. Specifically, it was born in a movement called the Conspiracy of Equals, led by a guy named Gracchus Babeuf. His name was Babeuf, but he called himself Gracchus. after the Gracchi brothers of ancient Rome. But he led an insurrection against the revolutionary government of France in the final phases of France's revolution. I think it's 1792. His attempted insurrection was stopped and he was executed, this man Babeuf. But ever since he was recognized, including by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels themselves, they recognized Babeuf as the first modern communist. And so the first communism emerged on the streets of revolutionary Paris under the direct supervision of the British secret intelligence services, which had instigated that revolt. And in fact, Babeuf himself had British intelligence handlers, just as Woodrow Wilson did in the example I gave before. And I name the names, I give the details in my book. It's very, very clear and undeniable that the British were in control of the French revolutionary situation. And likewise, they were in Russia more than 100 years later, when the Tsar was overthrown and the country was plunged into a civil war, and ultimately the Bolsheviks took power, which was done under the supervision of the British War Office. The British War Office under Winston Churchill was directly in charge of the whole Russian theater of war during the Civil War. They were running it in the sense that they put 60,000 British troops on the ground in between 1918 and 1919. I think they were all there in 1918, certainly. The British organized a multinational expeditionary force, which included 13,000 American troops, I think in the vicinity of 300,000 Japanese troops, and large contingents from other allied countries at the end of World War I. They brought all these nations into Russia to interfere in their civil war, and with the supposed purpose of crushing the Bolshevik revolution. That's how the British got all these countries to join, was by telling them, oh, this terrible threat has emerged of Bolshevism, and so we must stop it. And so the problem for historians has long been, given the overwhelming forces that were arrayed against the Bolsheviks from the moment they took power on November 7th, 1917, how did the Bolsheviks win? They literally had every country in the world, every great power in the world, had landed troops in Russia and was supposedly trying to stop the Bolsheviks. Meanwhile, whatever was left of the Tsarist armies and the Tsarist officer corps had organized themselves as a counter-revolutionary army, the so-called White Russians, who eventually coalesced under the command of Admiral Kolchak. And so in the very first months of the Bolshevik Revolution, they basically had taken control, that is, the Bolsheviks had taken control of two cities, Petrograd or St. Petersburg and Moscow. They were completely surrounded by these allied expeditionary forces, by the White Russian forces, and by various separatist forces, because all these constituent parts of the Russian Empire had declared their independence, and many were fighting hot wars against the Bolsheviks for their independence, and this especially Poland, but also Finland, the Baltic states, and Ukraine, Caucasus, various other regions had all broken away, declared their independence, and so the Bolsheviks were completely surrounded, literally from every direction, cut off from supply lines, underfunded, underarmed, undersupplied, and moreover, their commander-in-chief was a guy named Leon Trotsky, who had zero military experience, had never served in any military, had no military training, and he was a British agent to boot. Trotsky, as I think I convincingly prove in my book, was recruited by British intelligence possibly as early as 1902. And it's quite likely that other top Bolsheviks were also recruited although it's not sure to what degree, but they were all going to London regularly, beginning in 1902, and meeting with high-level British officials and especially members of the British Roundtable movement. And so Lenin was famously there in London. There have been books written about this. But Trotsky was also there, Stalin, all the top Bolsheviks were there, and they went there regularly. And often the Bolsheviks held their party congresses in London. Sometimes they held them elsewhere in other European capitals, but usually in London. So the British were intimately in contact with and working with the top Bolshevik leadership from the very beginning, and from starting many years before the revolutions in Russia started. And the British were always complicit in those revolutions, always controlling them behind the scenes, starting with the 1905 revolution and then the final revolutions of 1917. And Trotsky in particular, I name him in particular as a British agent because the evidence in his case is overwhelming. He was accused and tried of being a British agent by the Stalin government in the treason trials of 1937-38. He was convicted of being a British spy in absentia. He was no longer in the country then. But the chief witness against him was a Soviet diplomat named Christian Rakovsky, who testified that he had been forcibly recruited by the British while in London, that they had presented him with a forged letter that was incriminating to him. They had forced him to agree to become an agent of MI6. Rakovsky testified that he returned to Moscow to confront Trotsky, who he had been led to believe was involved with this whole scheme to set him up and recruit him. And he testified to the Soviet tribunal that Trotsky had confirmed in Moscow that, yes, he was involved, that they had set him up, that they had forged this letter to incriminate him, and that Trotsky had told him that from now on, you and I are going to be working with British intelligence. Now, that is a Soviet show trial, so it's not definitive evidence. I mean, they did use torture and other forcible means to get people to testify to things, but still, it's an actual trial, and it convicted Trotsky of being a British agent, and most of the information that came forth can be independently confirmed.
Yes, and it matches some of the other references you give for how Trotsky was a British agent, and people can read the book and find out more about it. Richard, just thank you so much. That's extraordinary. One of the things I want to say about you, distinct from me, is you're clearly someone who's great at detail and historical detail. I'm not at all, which is why that's not my strength, right? Which is why your book, being as accessible as it is, was so useful. There's a couple of points I want to add to what you're saying. So one is the notion of fractals, and what you said earlier about how human beings we haven't changed. We like to think that somehow the 21st century modern human is more evolved. No, we're still genociding each other. And, whether that's in Gaza or Ukraine, or what happened in the 70s with the Khmer Rouge, what they did to their own people in Cambodia, that's like the British killing 20 million Indians. Human nature hasn't changed that much. We do this to each other, tragically, and we keep doing it to each other, and we're no better and no worse than human beings of yesterday. Then for fractals, the idea of patterns of behavior on different scales, I can get, as a child protection social worker, one of the things I deal with is domestic abuse, where usually a man is saying to his partner, I'll tell you when you can go out. I'll tell you what to wear. I'll tell you who you can mix with. I'll tell you how long you can go out for. Don't worry about having an independent livelihood. I'll give you some pin money. And I'm doing all this for your own good. Well, that's what governments were saying to us during lockdown. It's the same conversation on a much, much larger scale. So then I can see how an abuser, when they leave a particular household, one of the things that they do very often is they exert control by other means, by financial means, or through relationships, through that family network, exerting control. So then I can see how the British elite family, whoever they are, these British elites families, in the background, exerting control by other means because they're not able to do so directly. And they'll do, the ruling class do that with their own populations. They exert control by other means. I would argue that what we have right now in the British Parliament is an abusive setup where Keir Starmer's government can ride through any objections whatsoever, not take into account any of those objections or any issues raised by the opposition, and just push through whatever they want to push through. And then I can see how that played out with the British control of India. I've read a bit about the history of the Raj and how they did it. And one of the things that the British did is they made deals with local Nawabs, because India was broken up into little kingdoms where you had a Nawab or a Raja or a Rani or whatever running the show. And they would do deals. They'd go to the Nawab and say, listen, we'll do this deal with you. We'll let you keep a certain amount of power or superficial power. You help us out. We'll help you out. And if you don't agree, well, we'll kill you or find some other way. So they get to capture them. But that was within the kingdoms within India. Well, why not you extend the fractal to a larger scale? That pattern can then show up on a international scale, like as you described how the British invented communism as a way to attack and undermine Russia, the one country which is this massive behemoth with all these resources that the British haven't managed to rule or conquer. They had to make do with little India instead, and a large amount of Africa, but they couldn't get Russia. So it all makes sense from that point of view. I just wanted to add that to your analysis.
Well, I think I completely agree with that, and it's very insightful and a little discomforting, your metaphor of an abusive relationship. But there are those who argue that government itself, as we humans have conceived it throughout our time on Earth, that it is, there is a parallel, that it is abusive by nature. And I don't go so far as that. I do think government is necessary, but it certainly is true that the difference between a good government and a bad government, let's say, a tyrannical government and a benevolent government, the difference is not so much as we might think. It's easy to slip from one to the other, let's say, as we are perhaps seeing in the UK right now, but I don't really want to pick on the UK. We're seeing it in the United States as well, obviously, many of the same phenomena. But yes, it is a perennial problem of our human condition that, in my opinion, I think we need government. Some say we don't, but I certainly think we need it. But it's kind of like government is kind of like a wild beast. It's hard once you establish it. It's a great struggle to keep it under the control of the people, and it's not even clear if ultimately that's possible or sustainable. And this is why Benjamin Franklin said of our government, he said it's a republic if you can keep it. He said to someone. It was always an experiment what we did here in America. Can we take what is essentially the British system of government, which was arguably very enlightened, and can we make it better? And can we make a government that's going to keep even freer than they would be in the old world? And I think the jury's still out. We're still trying, and it's very clear, especially now in these last few years, that the forces that want to oppress us and tyrannize us are alive and well, and it remains to be seen.
Right.
Sorry?
I think the work that you do is really important because it exposes how they operate. How they operated in India, how they operated with the French Revolution, how they operated with the Russian Revolution, through proxies, through agents. One of the things that Tom Luongo points out is how Scotland, Ireland, at certain points, senior ministers in the British government and I don't know Jagmeet Singh's family, where they're from in Canada, but they're all ruled by, all those positions were held by Indian elite families. And what the British did in India is they sponsored and supported those families. How they were able to rule India is through divide and rule, by having agents or agencies work as their proxies. So you had, Muslims policing Hindu areas, and Hindus policing Muslim areas, and now you have a, Indian-born elite holding power, holding sway over certain positions in the West, and those Indian-born elite were there through their inherited families that the British supported to help them run India. So it completely makes sense, and of course the British had to be bloody good at it because their empire was over 1/4 of the world from this tiny nation, and then it brings to, and this I found shocking. I don't dispute it, but it was an eye-opener, if true, that, and I suspect that it is because you give citations, that Kissinger, I know that Kissinger appointed Klaus Schwab. I didn't know that Kissinger was a British asset.
Mm.
So then that puts the WEF under the control of these British elites. So then I'm curious, your take on the Great Reset and how they're operating, plus also where Trump stands, because it seems to me that he's in opposition to that globalist agenda. Him saying we're going to get rid of the world, they're going to stop funding the World Health Organization, they're going to pull out the Paris Climate Accords, both of which I agree with, by the way, just to paint my flag to the mast. So, what have you? Please comment on that. The WEF, Trump's position with regards to all of this.
Well, I revealed and laid out in my book how the World Economic Forum is directly descended from the British Round Table, and that its actual purpose was to recruit people all over the world and to indoctrinate them and to develop them into agents who would further the Round Table agenda, which was the globalist agenda, but not just the globalist agenda, but specifically the concept of a global government in which the power core of that government is this super state comprised of all the English-speaking countries of the world. It's a very specific plan which came out of England and which appears to be the plan that is being implemented. Get all the English-speaking countries together into a super state, and from that English-speaking core will emanate the authority to rule the world through these globalist organizations. This is the Roundtable agenda. And the World Economic Forum, although it doesn't express what it's doing in those terms, it's very clear organizationally, genealogically. We can trace a line of mentorship going from Alfred Milner, who was the putative founder of the Roundtable Group, at least in its incarnation when it was called the Roundtable Group. But Alfred Milner inherited the leadership from Cecil Rhodes before him, and Rhodes inherited it from who knows what else. They keep changing the name of this group. It goes by different names, but it's always the same group. It's basically a secret society or a semi-secret society composed of British elites who are committed to what we now call globalism, although Queen Victoria helpfully described it as world dominion. It's important to remember that. And so Alfred Milner mentored a guy named Lindsay at Oxford, who became one of the top globalists. Lindsay mentored an American named William Yandell Elliott, who was one of the first American members of the American branch of the Round Table. And he went to Oxford after his World War I service in 1918, 1919. This William Yandell Elliott studied with Lindsay, who was mentored by Alfred Milner. Then Elliott came back to the US and he mentored Kissinger at Harvard. And he recruited Kissinger into the CIA in 1951. But both of these men, Elliott and Kissinger, had very close cooperative relationships with British intelligence that predated even the existence of the CIA. And the CIA itself was created with the active support and training and encouragement of British intelligence. They wanted us to have a competent foreign intelligence agency to help them manage their empire. And so while Elliot recruited Kissinger into the CIA, it's very clear they were both serving the Round Table first and foremost. Their first loyalty was to the Round Table and its globalist agenda. And then Kissinger went on to mentor young Klaus Schwab and to help him form the World Economic Forum in 1971. It was under a different name at first, but it was the same group. And its purpose was, again, to perpetuate and to nurture the ideas of the Round Table, the idea of a global government presided over by an English-speaking elite embodied in this English-speaking superstate, which is now being openly proposed on the X platform as we speak, and which Elon Musk, for whatever reason, personally endorsed only yesterday.
Yes.
It's getting interesting.
It is getting very interesting. And where does the EU fit in all this? Because Britain wasn't an originating member of the EU.
I disagree with that. If you look into the origins of the EU, you'll see there are several different stories going around. In fact, I found some years ago two totally conflicting BBC stories, one of which said Winston Churchill was opposed to the idea of European unification, and another which said he was all for it. And you find this kind of deliberate confusion fostered at every level of the globalist enterprise. Again, I'll remind you of the confusion over Woodrow Wilson, that he supposedly wanted a League of Nations when actually he was instructed by the British government to form a League of Nations, and he was moved to do it by British agents who surrounded him in the White House. And so this is part of how the British operate. They create confusion over whose idea this was, what were they for, what were they against. They put up various puppets parroting different narrative lines to create this confusion. But I personally have no doubt whatsoever that the British totally supported the formation of the European Union, as well as all of these other regional unions, such as the African Union. I actually did some research on the African Union for a think tank more than 10 years ago, and I discovered to my astonishment that the British were 100% behind the creation of the African Union, and that they were running the whole thing from South Africa and through UN NGOs. Meanwhile, they were pretending that Muammar Gaddafi, that it was all his idea, supposedly, to form an African Union, and that the purpose of it supposedly was so the African people could unite against neo-colonialism. But actually, it was an an instrument of neo-colonialism, and it was being run by the British. I did considerable research on that for a think tank, which hasn't been published, as it turned out. But this is how the whole thing worked. I did enough research into this through the years that I'm extremely skeptical now of any claim by the British that they're not in favor of some global initiative or another. Once you dig into these things, they're always at the heart of it. But it takes digging sometimes.
Okay, that you've reminded me of something, because when the whole Brexit referendum was happening, I was looking into the EU myself, and I'm proud to say I voted for Brexit. And one of the things I came across was how the CIA and the United States wanted a European Union, which would then make sense that the UK, these British elites, are using the CIA and the US as their proxies to push forward the notion of the EU. And that would be consistent with the UK wanting, those British elites wanting an African Union, because then you introduce the notion of nations giving up their sovereignty for a sort of partial globalist setup, which can then be subsumed into a much larger globalist setup. So we have an arrangement now where it seems to me certainly that the EU are very closely aligned with the World Health Organization and the United Nations. and it's a simple step for them to become part of a global setup.
Yes, well, the point you brought up, that the historical record has kind of been seeded with this idea that Americans wanted a European Union and the CIA somehow did it. But the CIA didn't even exist until 1948, and prior to that, we had the OSS for a few years, which was completely a creation of British intelligence. They basically created this entity for the Americans because we didn't have such an entity, and they needed our help in World War II and in setting up the post-war era. The British were extremely dissatisfied with our intelligence capabilities, and rightly so. They considered us to be amateurs who didn't know what we were doing, and they helped us set the whole thing up. And they were absolutely right. We were nowhere near being in the same league as the British in terms of intelligence and covert operations and so forth. And the fact that we have any competence in this field at all is directly due to British advice and training, which actually began even before World War One. They helped us set up the FBI. They helped us set up the Foreign Intelligence Service we had, beginning with World War One. And it's a remarkable story that most Americans are totally not familiar with. But basically, we wouldn't have a Foreign Intelligence Service with any level of professionalism, except by the help of Britain. And they gave this to us because they wanted our help to manage this global empire they were building. So, was the CIA supportive of a European Union? I'm sure, but was it their idea? Was it ultimately an American idea? No, I don't think so, because it was always the British from the beginning who were pushing globalism. Again, going back at least to the Napoleonic era, when they began publicly and blatantly stating that this was their goal.
Yeah. And then borrowing from your ideas, which really have come to me via Tom Luongo and Alex Craner originally, it seems to me that Israel, as a Zionist project, is a proxy agent for the British, and that through the APAC lob, through APAC and similar, it's another way that the British exert control over the United States. But Israel, it seems to me that Israel is a colonial outpost of the British, masquerading as a colonial outpost of the US.
Yeah, I mean, the part that I would agree with, I mean, obviously, Zionism was a British foreign policy initiative. My understanding is that when the decision was made by Britain to destroy their long-term ally, the Ottoman Empire, and British had been allied off and on with the Ottomans for centuries. They used the Ottomans as a counterweight to Russia in what the British called the Great Game, trying to keep the Russians from advancing southward into the Middle East and into India. So they had always cultivated the Ottomans as a key ally in that region. But by the time World War One came along, the British had already decided that it was time for the Ottomans to go. They weren't going to prop up the so-called sick man of Europe anymore. And so this was, at that time, Britain totally defeated and dismembered the Ottoman Empire, occupied the entire Middle East, and it turned the Middle East into a British colony. And so it was in the context of that, the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the occupation of the Middle East by the British, which was a burden they didn't want to keep for very long. You know, the British had to control the Middle East, especially then, not only because of the trade routes to the east, the traditional reason for that region's importance, but then oil had been discovered in the early 1900s. And the British wanted to have complete and total control of that. And so they were actually given control of the Iranian oil fields by Leon Trotsky within days of the Bolshevik Revolution. British agent Trotsky appointed himself foreign commissar and basically gave the gift to the British of withdrawing all Russian claims, all Russian interests in Iran. And the Russians had all of northern Iran in their sphere of influence with all of its oil. they said, we no longer have any interest in Iran. They turned over the whole country to the British. And so the British, through their agent Trotsky, got control of the Iranian oil, which was the biggest oil, I think the only Middle Eastern oil strike known at that time. They politically and militarily took control of the rest of the Middle East to fill the power vacuum left by the Ottoman Empire falling apart. And then they needed a replacement. And as I understand it, the idea of creating a Jewish state in that region, the idea was to put in the Jewish state as a replacement for the Ottoman power which had fallen, and which would be reliably obedient to British foreign policy goals. And I think that was the whole reason why the British got behind that idea. Now, there are a lot of people on X and social media generally who, at this point, would be throwing tomatoes at me and telling me, "Oh, it's all a lie. It's a Jewish plot." And how can you say? Basically, what they claim is, "Oh, there is no such place as Great Britain. There's no such entity. It's just a piece of real estate owned by the Rothschilds. So you're just saying Great Britain did it is just another way of saying the Jews did it." Okay, I understand that's a position a lot of people hold, and it seems to be a position that's somehow being encouraged right now on some official or unofficial level. But I don't find it plausible. I mean, this idea that Britain was taken over by Jews, uh, first of all, when did it happen? I mean, there are people who say it happened in 1066, that William the Conqueror brought some Jews, and they were basically lending him money, and they've been running England ever since. There's another school of thought that says Jews have controlled England since 1694, since the establishment of the Bank of England. I don't see much evidence to support that either. And then there's another theory that the Rothschilds somehow got control of the country in 1815 after the Battle of Waterloo. But I don't see any agreement on these dates, and I don't. I guess it's a case of extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, and I think to say that England has been controlled by Jews since before it became a global empire, well, that's basically saying that Jews rule the world. Well, I don't believe in censorship. I think if people want to make that case, they should, but I haven't seen that case made very well factually. I haven't seen the facts presented, and
Richard, just to be clear, I'm not, just so it's clear, and anybody watching this, I'm not saying that. I just don't know, and I think that I think ruling elites don't give a fig about people's religions or ethnicity. You know, the British ruling class Protestants, they killed their own kind. They killed other Protestants. They killed Catholics. They're Hindus, Muslims, Jews. They don't care. What they're interested in is their own power. And whether they're Jewish or Catholic or Protestant or whatever, I personally think is immaterial, because Zionism isn't Judaism. I'm really clear about that. But I can get how, you know, what I'm saying is, it seems to me that the British created Israel, the whole Zionist project, as a way of keeping in check the peoples around Israel, where there's all this oil. You know, you break apart the Ottoman Empire, you then have, instead of giving the Kurds a territory of their own, their territory is split up between Iran, Syria, Iraq, and Turkey, as a way that they can use to foment dissent through their divide and rule strategy. You break apart India as East Pakistan and West Pakistan and India, and then you can create conflict between those peoples. You break apart Pakistan, you know, with the Duran line in such a way that you always have the opportunity to create conflict. You don't give Northern Ireland to the Irish when you leave, because then you can, that is there as a cankerous sore, again for divide and rule. And that they did that with the Ottoman Empire by creating Israel, and the lines that were drawn by Sykes-Picot. I'm just saying that's how it seems to me, and I'm interested in your commentary on that.
well, to the extent I understand what you're saying, I think I certainly agree, as I said before, that it was obviously the idea of putting a Jewish state in Palestine was obviously a British foreign policy objective that was enunciated very clearly even before the Balfour document. And I believe it was for the reasons that I stated. I believe that British imperial policy understood that if they were going to knock out the Ottoman Empire, and that decision had already been made, they had to fill that power vacuum somehow. And they initially filled it by occupying directly the Middle East with British troops. But the British don't normally like to do that. This is something people don't understand a lot of times, that for the British, when they have to actually go in and raise the Union Jack and occupy a country, that's negative for them. That means they have to spend a lot of money. They have to risk military clashes with hostile forces. They have to deal with world opinion being against them. They don't like that at all. They will only occupy an area militarily as long as they have to prevent others from moving in. But they will, as soon as possible, they will try to replace themselves with some other body, some other authority that can act as their proxy. So now my understanding of the Middle East, I'm not an expert on this area, please understand that. But I read a book some years ago called Peace to End All Peace, and I'm sorry I can't remember the author's name, but it was a very, very good book about this very subject. How did we get the Middle East that we have today? And what this author said was that the British had a two-pronged plan. One was to establish the state of Israel, while at times pretending they were opposed to the state of Israel, which is interesting. But at the same time, they had another plan, which was to raise up a British proxy state in Turkey, in the original state of the Ottoman Empire, to strip the Ottomans, that is, of all of their extraneous provinces, but to build up Turkey as a new liberal republic, which would be controlled by Britain. And what they tried to do in Turkey, according to this book, they actually tried to set up Turkey not only as a political capital of all the Arab and Muslim states, even though Turks are not Arabs, of course, but they also tried to set up a religious authority. The British had this idea that if they could set up a Muslim figure who could somehow be given the authority of a sort of Muslim pope, and put him in Ankara, in Turkey, under the protection of this British-friendly Turkish government, that they would be able to actually control the religious views of Muslims all over the world. And this was a very key problem for Britain, especially at that time, where most of the Muslims in the world were actually under British jurisdiction at that point, and they were a big headache for the British. And you can see a lot of writings from the colonial era where British colonial officials speak about the special problem of the Muslims, that yes, they can be very useful for certain things, especially for balancing off against other troublesome people, but they're very unpredictable. They're given to, here I'm paraphrasing from these British officials, that the Muslims are very given to sudden seizures of religious hysteria, which cause them to do unpredictable things.
Any moment, Richard, now I'm going to be seized by religious hysteria, just to warn you.
Well, as I said, I'm paraphrasing from these writings from more than 100 years ago. But so I read in this book, it's called The Peace to End All Peace, that the British attempted to resolve this problem, how to control the Muslims, by creating a Muslim pope who would be installed under this British-friendly Turkish government. And apparently it didn't work, because
Really?
the Muslims were supposedly too decentralized, that they were more sort of like Protestants in the fact they valued the independence of their own little local area leaders. I don't know if that's true. That's what it said in this book, but it's a fascinating idea. Someday I would like to study it as thoroughly as I've studied these other matters, but I can only tell you what it said in this book, which seemed quite plausible to me.
Well, thank you for that. What I want to do, I want to finish up in a few moments, right? Before I break out into some religious hysteria, right? Because so far I've managed not to do that on camera in any of my interviews. And I just want to say, I do recommend people, I'll have this up as an overlay, how the British invented communism and blamed it on the Jews. But you've written other stuff as well.
Well, yes. In the last 5 years or so, I've written a number of articles on this subject of British power in the world and how Britain's globalist agenda has really driven the affairs of my own country, the United States. And so that's been my focus. And the reason is, now I've been writing for many years. My first published book was back in 1991. I've written a number of bestsellers, New York Times bestsellers, on all kinds of different subjects. Back in the 90s, I did self-help books. I did all kinds of books. Um, but in 2006, now this was during the period I was working in think tanks. I'd gotten into that field in 2000, I guess. Started working in think tanks, being very politically involved, and running websites for think tanks. And I turned my writing from in a much more political direction. One of the books that I wrote during that period was a book called The Shadow Party, which I wrote. It was published in 2006, and I co-wrote that with my then boss, David Horowitz. I was working for his think tank, the David Horowitz Freedom Center at the time. And this book was one of the first real exposés of George Soros and how he had taken over the Democratic Party through certain legal and financial maneuvers, and further how he had been deeply involved in color revolutions all around the world. And our book was picked up by Glenn Beck. In 2010, he used the Shadow Party, Glenn Beck, that is, as the basis for his famous Puppet Master series. It was a three-part expose of George Soros and how he did color revolutions around the world. And it basically got Glenn kicked off Fox News. I think Glenn might disagree with me now in saying that, but I was there through that whole period and how it played out. It was very clear that going at, I mean, Soros, the whole thing started with Soros announcing he was going to get Glenn Beck kicked off of Fox News. And so Glenn retaliated by attacking him with this three-part Puppet Master series. And it was based on our book, on The Shadow Party. And I was interviewed on the show, on a couple of those shows. And it reached a record audience, and it got George Soros very mad. And then Glenn was kicked off Fox News. So I don't know. It's been written about, but the point is, so now that I'm discussing the British aspect of it, it's you could see it as a continuation of this previous research that I had done, because I got very interested in this whole idea of color revolutions, in George Soros's involvement in color revolutions. But the one topic I deliberately never brought up was British involvement in these matters. Even though I was actually quite well informed, I'd been studying that question for 30 years, at least since the early 90s, and I knew quite a lot about it. But one thing I knew is that talking about this kind of covert British influence over American foreign policy and American life in general, this is, or at least it was, a deadly taboo. And I understood that if I went there, that would be something that would end my career. And I understood that very, very well. And only now, in the age of social media, in the age of Trump, in this age when a lot of rules seem to be falling apart, I decided I'm going to break the taboo. I'm going to talk about British influence. I'm going to talk about the various books and authors and people who have pointed me in the direction of looking at British influence. And so far, they haven't hit me that hard. I have been called a Russian agent. I have been accused of spouting Russian propaganda,
Yes.
specifically because of what I'm saying about the British, which is kind of interesting. I guess the reasoning is, oh, if you're not totally 100% gung ho about the NATO alliance and the wonders and glories of Anglo-American globalism, that means you must be with the Russians. So,
and referring to my use of fractals, it's playground taunts. on a larger scale as adults. It's just the argument of smearing. Rather than deal with the content of what you're saying, I'm just going to call you names. But because we're not kids in a playground, I'll use a more sophisticated adult version. Or you must
Right.
be Putin's puppet.
Right.
Let's have a look at I mean, they did that a lot with Jeremy Corbyn. You know, he's anti-Semitic. Do we have any evidence here? And all those that oppose the war in Ukraine, like Corbyn and Trump and Orban, they're far right. It's just insane.
Well, yes,
Background name calling.
and this, you know, this issue, this oversensitivity, if you want to call it that, is typically applied to the question of anti-Semitism, rightly or wrongly. But I guess what I'm saying is people don't realize if you start going after the British, you want to see oversensitivity, you will see it. And often they'll, in the typical British way, they'll get others to go after you from a different direction. But literally, the first time, well, I'm going to say the L word, LaRouche. You know, Lyndon LaRouche is a researcher. He's dead now, but he of course, is famous for being one of the important voices speaking out about British influence going back to the 1980s and even 70s. And I had read his stuff for a long, long time, but I absolutely knew you can't, as someone who was then working in mainstream media, writing books for mainstream publishers, working in mainstream think tanks, I could not say, oh, gee, I read something interesting in this LaRouchian book. That would be the end of your career right there. Right. And what they would typically say is LaRouche was a fascist, a racist, and an anti-Semite, and that's what made the accusation so potent. So, but actually, LaRouche, far from being a fascist, he was clearly a man of the left. He was, in fact, a Trotskyite in his youth. He supposedly changed from being a Trotskyite to something else, but the LaRouchites worship FDR and his New Deal. They were clearly on the left. And but what they were accused of is being on the right and of being anti-Semitic. I see no sign there either.
No, just a smear.
But no, that, I'm sorry?
Sorry, to know who's ruling over you, well, you got to know who you can't criticize.
Right. Well, that's what I'm trying to say, because if LaRouche is known for anything, it's calling out the British and pointing out the British influence and the British covert mechanisms of control. But if you dared during that period, and, you know, LaRouche was thrown in jail in the 1990s, he and some of his people. So it was a really serious thing, and you could not even breathe or hint that there was any influence at all from him. So when I finally decided, okay, look, it's, I think it was last year sometime, 2024, said it's 2024, I'm not getting any younger. I'm just going to say, look, I've been influenced by LaRouche, among others, on this issue. Immediately, boom, I had people popping out saying, Poe admits that he's been influenced by LaRouche. Everyone knows LaRouche is a communist Soviet agent, or was, so Poe might be a Soviet agent. Right. Instantly, and by people whom I had previously thought, you know, would be friendly towards me, or some sort of colleague who knew and worked with some of the same people I had. It was instantaneous, just instantaneous, and a little unexpected that they chose to call me a communist or a communist agent instead of a fascist or an anti-Semite, which would have been the what they would have called me back in the 90s. But this is what I'm saying. So even now, you know, this idea of trying to call out British influence and talk about it, it's dangerous. It's absolutely dangerous. Judge Napolitano on Fox News, he was fired from Fox News when he revealed that the British GCHQ had bugged or helped bug Trump Tower. He was actually fired for that. Wow. Even though it was true. And he finally got rehired again. But once he was rehired, he had undergone a strange transformation, and he became anti-Trump, whereas before he had been pro-Trump. So this is the kind of thing that happens when you go after the British. It's not spectacular and in everybody's face, but weird things happen. Weird things happen.
Well, Richard, on that note, with the possibility of weird things happening, And weird things are going to keep happening anyway, whether it's the British or not, or whoever, right? That's just the nature of life. Is there anything you want to say before we finish up?
I would simply say I do hope people will read my book, and I appreciate your pointing out that it's entertaining and easy to read, because that's what I always try to do. You know, it shouldn't be an ordeal to read. The book is short, and I made it as easy and entertaining as possible to digest.
Yes.
It's called How the British Invented Communism and Blamed It on the Jews. You can get it at Amazon, wherever good books are sold. I have a website, richardpoe.com. I'm on X at Real Richard Poe.
Very good. I shall have all the links in the description below. And I don't. My brother, by the way, is a history professor, and I don't like reading history. But your book is great for people who don't like reading history because
Thank
it's
you.
so accessible. So, Richard, thank you so much. It's been an absolute delight talking to you. Real education. Really appreciate it. And for anybody who's watching, if you haven't got this book, go get this book. Go check out his work. And between now and when I see you next, please keep filling your heart and your pockets with love and freedom and joy. This is Richard and Rich signing out. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you.